Today's date is January 26th, 2024. My name is Kelly Zakovic. I'm representing the City of Savannah's Municipal Archives, and I'm interviewing Leonard Brown for the Savannah Community Memory Project. We're conducting this interview at the Liberty City Community Center. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about what you brought here?
Yeah, my name is Leonard Brown. We say Leonard in Savannah, Leonard other places. But today I brought this book that I published, Community Progress in the Midst of Oppression. And it is stories, narratives of people who grew up in certain sections of Savannah. On the cover is the picture of my great-grandfather, Matthew Robinson, and Eva Robinson. We found this among my father's possessions, and we were able to restore this picture. So this book talks a lot about what it was like growing up in different sections of Savannah through the voices of my relatives who lived in the different sections of the city.
Okay. Any particular recollections that stand out to you from it?
One of the things that I wrote in this book relative to Wormslow Plantation, when I was a child, my father used to take us to the plantation, to this person's house. I think his name was Deacon Johnson. He lived on the plantation. And we would pull up to the gate, and there were gatekeepers. We'd have to blow the horn. We went down the tree-lined streets to Mr. Johnson's house. We would commune him, and we would always ask our father, could we not go into the big house? Not this little house that Mr. Johnson lived in. But that's one of the greatest recollections that I have of Wormslow Plantation, taking communion to Mr. Johnson, who was a member of First African Baptist Church.
Interesting. Okay, well, thank you so much for bringing that and sharing that with us. So I'm going to jump in, and we're going to talk a little bit about maybe Liberty City or District 5. But if you have things that you'd like to share about all across the city, feel free to share those as well. Where were you born and when were you born?
I was born in Savannah, Georgia at Charity Hospital, March 2nd, 1951.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in Liberty City to begin with. We lived at 1920 West 55th Street, which is now Lloyd Street. And Liberty City was a great place to grow up as a child because there were no street lights. The streets were not paved, and you were free to play without any disturbances.
And what were your parents' names?
My parents' names were Matthew Southorn Brown Sr. He bought his first little house in Liberty City, and Lottie Williams Brown, who grew up in Yamacraw. So.
And when did they move out to Liberty City?
Well, that was, when I was born, they were here. So it had to have been before 1951. So we stayed here for a while until we moved to Victory Drive, where my grandmother owned property, and we lived there for quite a while.
How old were you when you moved out there?
Moved.
To Victory Drive?
We must have been in our 12, 13 years old.
Okay.
Because we spent a lot of time here in Liberty City.
And when you lived out here, where did you go to school?
We went to Durin Elementary School right down the street. And the parents had carpooling that we did because there was no buses that picked us up. Mm-hmm. So Mrs. Bryant, my mother, Miss Palmer, those ladies, and Miss Page got together to get us to school.
And where did kids go to, like, high school or other schools?
Well, by the time I got to high school, we were living on Victory Drive.
Mm-hmm.
And we went to Beach Junior High School, Beach Senior High School, all in walking distance. So we enjoyed walking back and forth to school.
And where do you live now?
Strangely enough, I live at 2704 Stevens Street, behind the house that my grandmother owned and grandfather and my father lived in. So I lived in a garage apartment behind my parents' and grandparents' house. And the interesting thing about where I live is the fact that my grandmother built that little house. She had her mother in that house, and now I live in that house, and I wanted to restore it to show my appreciation for the hard work that they did in producing that.
And what neighborhood is that in?
That's in Cann Park.
Okay, very nice. So did you ever live in Liberty City again after you moved out as a kid?
No, once we left Liberty City, we were gone.
Do you have any recollections of living out here as a kid, or anything that you'd like to share about growing up out here?
One of the things I remembered was the mosquito man. There were lots of mosquitoes out here, and this mosquito truck would come and he would fog up the entire street, and we, not knowing any better, would run behind the truck. That was interesting. And also I remember there was a lady who lived down the street, Miss Drayton. She had lots of kids, and we played with them and had a good time that way.
Were there any playgrounds or ball fields or anything for
There
the
were
kids
no
out here?
playgrounds or ball fields, but another thing I remember, there were ditches, drainage ditches, and they were filled with tadpoles. And we would get our jars and get the tadpoles and watch them live and die in the containers. So another thing I remember too is my father, when we went to First African Church, he would always have some senior citizen in the car with him. There was a lady who lived down the street named Miss Brown, and her grandson named Victor. And we would always pick up Miss Brown and Victor, and we'd all be packed in this little 1954 Plymouth going to First African.
So I know that your father was an important community leader. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about him?
As I mentioned before, they always looked out for other people. We were always carrying some senior citizen somewhere riding with us. And he had a heart for the people, and he sacrifices a lot of his time and family time giving to the people of Savannah. He lived to be 99 years old. And, we have great memories of what he did. And everywhere I go, I just moved back to Savannah about 3 years ago. Everywhere I go and mention his name, he's spoken very highly of, highly regarded. And we appreciate that as his offsprings. One other thing I want to mention about Liberty City too, people will probably mention this also. Dr. Collier had a very beautiful house on the corner of Millsby Lane and Liberty Parkway. And I always thought that house was inspiration, saying that if I could do this, then you could do the same thing too. It still stands there. It's not occupied, but it was one of the key structures in the community. Another thing I appreciate about Liberty City was people built their homes, and they kept their property very nice also.
Are there any other notable buildings out here, or?
Well, what I can do is to name some of the families that I remember.
That'd be great.
The city attorney, Lester Johnson, he grew up in Liberty City. We lived right behind him, and we played with his sister Joyce. Mr. Jones, who lived in Liberty City, who was living in Atlanta at one time, was one of the first black police officers for the city of Atlanta. I didn't know this until I was an adult. And he lived in Liberty City also with his wife, Parnell. We had the Dingle family, who were great educators. So those are some of the people that I recalled when I lived. If you would allow me, I'd like to read one paragraph from what I read about growing up in Liberty City. Liberty City denotes a sense of freedom. During my formative years, Liberty City was a great place to discover, live, and come of age. In the mid and late 1950s, Liberty City's residential streets weren't paved. Our street, 55th, was called Lloyd. There were 6 families. There were the Browns, the Bryans, the Penningtons, the Draytons, the Browns, our cousins, and the Greshams. There were no street lights. The roads were drained by ditches filled with tadpoles. However, there was one thing that was intangible: the freedom to be a child in an environment in which we were encouraged to explore, run, discover, and daydream. So that capsulizes what it was like growing up in Liberty City. And if you think about the title, I don't know where the origin came from, but there was a sense of liberty in terms of freedom, in terms of space, in terms of play, and that kind of thing. I have one more story that I want to mention relative to Duran Elementary School, which was right down the street. There was an incident where the kids said that they were not going to eat lunch because they wanted to get the same amount of lunch that the teachers had. So we had a strike and said, we're not going to eat lunch. So the teachers took us back to our classrooms. And then they brought us back to the lunchroom, and when we got there, our parents were sitting there, and everybody started to cry. My question to this day is, how did those parents, first of all, find out what went on? We had the rotary phones, I would imagine. And how did they get off of their jobs or get to the school to make sure that we obeyed the rules? To this day, I don't understand. And most of the parents who were there weren't alive. But that just shows you how cohesive the community was and how the word got around. Needless to say, we cried and we ate.
We have heard from other people that your father was involved with the neighborhood association out here. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I remember he was the president of the PTA at George Duran Elementary School. And also he headed the neighborhood Liberty City Association in its early beginnings there. And there was another thing I wanted to mention too. There was a man who lived down the street, Mr. Jimerson. He had a hamburger shop up across from Duran School. But also Mr. Jimerson and my father and the men who lived out here had a rose garden club in which they planted roses. They talked about the roses. And every time I pass Mr. Jimerson's house, I think about the Rose Garden Club that those men had amongst themselves, which I thought was interesting.
Did they plant roses at their own houses, or was there like a community
Seems
garden?
like they planted the roses in their houses, and then they would go from house to house to look at and talk about. Because I was a child, I was just, really not interested, but I just thought it was interesting in my latter years that they had that kind of interest. I found in my father's papers too, there was a garden club convention in Savannah, like in the 1980s, in which they had gardeners to come from across the state to the old auditorium downtown, or civic center, whichever it was. And I thought that was interesting too. He attended that, so he loved flowers and that kind of thing.
Fascinating. Do you know about any of the activities, the early activities of the neighborhood association out here, or how it came to be?
Not really, because when we lived out here, we were like from 0 to 13 years old, and associations were not important to us at that time.
Do you know what people out here did for work?
There was a combination, Dr. Collier, like I said, was a medical doctor. The Dingles were educators. My father, during his early years, was a postman. Mr. Lester Johnson, Dr. Johnson, taught at Savannah State, and he was a teacher at Beach High School. So you had a combination of people, from professionals to laborers. You had a mixture, a cross-section of people that lived here.
So you mentioned a hamburger shop. Do you remember any other businesses out here when you were growing up?
Mr. Smith had a store on Liberty Parkway. I remember that store that we used to go to. And that's the only business that I can recall there. We traveled to Bargain Corner downtown on Bay Street to shop, because I don't remember any grocery stores out here as far as I can recall back in the 50s. I don't know of any that I can think of.
And where did people out here worship?
I don't know, because we went to First African Church. I'm sure there are churches in the community in which they worshiped, but probably someone who'd been here for a while could mention that.
And how has the community changed since you left?
Well, to me, it looks very nice compared to when I was a child. There's a lot of development, and the thing that I appreciate about Liberty City is the fact that people still own their homes, and people have built nice homes out here. If you travel into the community, you'll see well-built homes out here. And I don't know about pricing, but I'm hoping that it's affordable to still live out here. So.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to share with us about Liberty City or your family?
Not that I can recall. I had a cousin that taught at Durin. Her name was Laura Webb. She and my father graduated from high school together. And I didn't know she was our cousin as a child. And if you want anything fixed in Durin School, you call Miss Webb, because she knew how to do things. She grew up on a farm with her parents, Derrick's Inn, out Highway 17, which is still in their family. And she knew how to do things, and she made an impression on me once I found out she was kin to us. Yeah.
Okay. So last chance, anything else you'd like to talk about?
Was there anything that you were going to mention relative to the Cann Park district?
If you, feel free. Yes.
Okay.
Tell us about Cann
Yeah,
Park.
because our real formative years, those teenage years, was in Cann Park, where we went to school. But Cann Park was a beautiful neighborhood because you had people. I'm fascinated right now with African American people who built their homes. And as I travel through Cann Park, I can point out the homes that were built by African Americans and designed by African Americans. For example, the house where my father lives, his mother had Mr. James Butler to design that house. It's on the corner of Victory Drive and Stevens. And they built that house in 1949. And it's still standing. So I'm fascinated by the ingenuity. That's why the title of this book was Progress in the Midst of Oppression. We were supposed to be an oppressed people, but at the same time, they were building houses. They were sending their children to school, and it was amazing to me how we had a good sense of ourselves and our abilities when people thought that we couldn't do anything. But we were in our own communities doing that.
How long did y'all live in Cann Park?
We're still living there. My father lived. When we moved from Liberty City, that had to have been in like the 60s. He lived in that house up until he died. My brother lives next door to my father's house, and that house is 100 years old. It was built it's over 100. It was built in 1920, and that's the house that my father grew up in. So we have 925, 927, and 2704 where I live. And my dad used to call that, he has his compound. So we are now in charge of his compound.
Very nice. What would you say the boundaries of Cann Park are?
The boundaries?
Mm-hmm.
That's something I really couldn't tell you. I know up on Victory Drive, when you go up to a certain portion of it, it's a part of kind of Brownville. Probably some other person may be able to tell you the boundaries of Cann Park. Mm-hmm.
Were there any important landmarks out there?
The thing that I can remember that brought the community together was the park itself. There was a lady by the name of Miss Crawford. She was hired by the city to be in charge of the park. She lived on 44th Street. And she would be the person who would pass on all the equipment, baseball, what have you. And she had a little green wooden container that she would let the kids use the different types of things to play with. But the park was the place. My father played on that park too. So, it was a uniting force within the community.
Very nice. Are there any other community leaders for Cann Park that we should know about?
We had what I call foundational families. Mr. Deacon John Delaware, you might have heard of him. He was very instrumental. There's a center that's named for him, the Delaware Center. He was a community activist, church man, worked with the Scouts. Mr. Law lived on Victory Drive, and I don't know whether he was in Cann Park or Kyla Brownville, but his house is still on Victory Drive, 2 blocks up from where I live. So, foundational families, the Delawares, the Warwicks, the Sessions, the Maynard. You probably talked to Carmelita or Altheria Maynard, Fletcher family. There's a minister that had a real nice house on 47th Street, Reverend Benton, and he's been dead for years, but his house is maintained, I guess, by the family, and it looks very nice, and it's looked like that for years. So there are certain foundational families that built their homes, their children stayed there, some have not. And now we're seeing a shift in the community. Another person I want to mention is Miss Sweeney, I think, Sweeney. She lived across from the park, and she used to sell thrills. And thrills were Kool-Aid and ice and put it in the freezer, and she'd sell them to the kids for like 5, 6 cents, whatever. So, and then you had a lady named Mama G. She worked at the high school and she would sell candy to the kids and that kind of thing. So you had small entrepreneurs. Another person I wanted to mention was George Williams, the Williams family. They owned Williams and Williams Funeral Home. We lived on 45th Street and also on Victory Drive. And their daughter, his daughter, Pamela, taught at Mahara Medical School for years. So we had people who did different types of things who came from the community.
And you said there's been a shift in the community?
Yeah, we're seeing now that a lot of the homes are being sort of gentrified, and people are moving into the community. And I don't know whether that's good or bad, but my father used to always say in the community meetings, people tell me that he would say, don't sell your property. And anybody who owns houses in these areas are confronted by mail just about every day, or phone calls about wanting to sell, your property. Can I buy your home? So if they're that interested, then there's something that, we know that's coming down the pipe. But we aren't selling the Brown compound. That's not for sale. As far as our generation goes now, the next generation, I don't know.
Any other shifts in, ways that it's changed?
That's the major thing that I see, is that the community is becoming more diversified as far as I see. And then too, I noticed also that there are certain things that are taking place in Cann Park, with the paving of streets and upgrading and that kind of thing. And I'm wondering to myself, you know, will we be able to afford to stay here in the next 10 years? And literally, a gentleman told my father that he was standing in front of his house, and he asked him, do you want to sell your house? And he told him no. And he said, well, sir, in the next 10 years, you're not going to be able to afford to live here. So we're still there. So, you know.
For growing up in Cann Park, what was your sort of favorite part about that?
The favorite part was Christmas. I keep talking about my father, but you know what he would do? He would round the kids up, because we'd get bicycles and skates, and he could skate. He was a great skater. And he would round the kids up. I have a picture of them. I wish I could have brought it. And we would skate all around 45th Street. 45th Street has a hill, and that's what he would do. We skate around Beach High School. That's the greatest memory that I have as a child.
Is that an annual tradition?
Not now, but it was back then, because children don't play outside like they used to.
What kind of facilities did Cann Park have for kids? The park itself?
Well, the standard things, the slides, the swings, baseball field, and there was something that we had. There was a pole that had a ball on it. I don't know what you call that. And we would hit the ball around the pole. I don't know what that was, but just the basic, equipment for the park. And none of it wasn't padded like it is today with, it was all steel and metal and that kind of thing. But something else that occurred to me too is that as you enter Cann Park, there was a water fountain right there. And that water fountain ran continuously. It seems like the city wouldn't fix it, but it was always running water. And that would be the gathering spot for a lot of the kids of that water fountain. I think it's still there, if I'm not mistaken. And that would be the clarion call, meet at the water fountain. One other thing, and you probably heard this before, is that at Cann Park, when the street lights fluttered, you needed to be back in the house.
So where did people worship in Cann Park?
You had a combination of people. You had a lot of people worked at the college. A lot of them were teachers. A lot of them worked for the city. A lot of them worked on the waterfront. Some were ministers. And the thing I liked about Liberty City and Cann Park is that people didn't look for a handout. They made a way out of no way. And they left something sustainable for their children in terms of property and that kind of thing. So, also Cann Park, I can remember too, my grandfather lived, on my mother's side, lived 2 streets over on 41st Street. My grandmother lived behind us, and my great-grandmother lived with her. And my aunt lived on 47th Street. So you had families on both sides of you. You could walk and visit them. But, and that was something memorable growing up.
Are there any community leaders for the neighborhood today that we should know about?
One of the persons that has been keeping things together, like I said, I just moved back 3 years ago, but the Maynard sisters, Altheria and Carmelita, are 2 of the community leaders there. And also Reverend Milo, who's a representative, lives in the community also. So, and I'm trying to get more involved with the association, because it seems that a lot of people are sort of are aging, and we need an influx of young people there.
Does the neighborhood association hold any events or?
From what I've understood, we did a park cleanup about 2 months ago during the summer. They've had the night out event, and you probably have to talk to, people who have been involved for a while. But those are the two things that I can remember them doing.
So is there anything else that you'd like to share about Cann Park with us?
Not really. I just want to mention the fact that Cann Park is still there, and it's a great place to live, and we're in Midtown Savannah, and it's highly desirable. So people need to consider moving into the Cann Park area, and people need to consider staying in the Cann Park area also.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Appreciate your recollection.